The mahogany dining table was perfectly set for their 15th anniversary, bathed in the warm amber glow of the chandelier. But Lucas stared only at the notification illuminating Victoria's discarded phone, a text from a man the entire town of Oakhaven had buried 5 years ago. There was a ghost breathing in their marriage, and tonight the illusion of their perfect life was about to shatter. If stories of fragile vows, buried secrets, and the dangerous edge of betrayal speak to you, stay with me as we unravel this one. The rain in Oakhaven always felt heavier on Tuesday nights, drumming a relentless, isolating rhythm against the colonial-style windows of the Scott residence. Inside the kitchen was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary and melting butter. Lucas Scott stood by the granite island, a damp dish towel slung over his shoulder, watching the woman he had loved for 15 years as she stared out into the wet, dark street. Victoria Sterling, she had kept her maiden name a small rebellion he had always found charming, until recently sat at the dining table. Her posture was rigid, her manicured fingers continuously tracing the rim of an untouched glass of Cabernet. She was physically present, yet her mind was miles away wandering a desolate landscape Lucas was no longer permitted to enter. "The roast needs another 10 minutes, Lucas said, his voice low, trying not to fracture the fragile silence of their anniversary evening. Victoria blinked, startled, as if pulled violently from a deep trance. She offered a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Take your time. I'm not very hungry anyway." It was the same hollow smile she had worn for months. The smile that quietly screamed, "I am functioning, but I am not here." Lucas turned back to the oven, the heat washing over his face, masking the sudden sharp tightening in his chest. He was a floor manager at Carter Industries. He understood heavy machinery, atmospheric pressure, and the subtle warning signs of a system about to critically fail. His marriage had been flashing red for a long time, and he had been willfully ignoring the alarms. A sharp buzz vibrated against the mahogany wood of the table. Victoria's phone screen lit up, illuminating the dark dining room. She had left it face up, a rare, careless mistake. Lucas, carrying a plate of warm artisan bread to the table, couldn't help but let his eyes drop to the glowing rectangle. He expected an email from her marketing firm. He expected a text from their teenage daughter complaining about homework. What he saw instead froze the blood in his veins. JG, the park by the old oak. 11 p.m. Don't make me wait, Vic. JG. The initials hit Lucas like a physical blow to the ribs. Joseph Garcia. It was an impossibility. It was a cruel, sick joke. Joseph Garcia had burned in a twisted wreck of metal on Route 95 years ago. The entire town of Oakhaven had attended the closed casket memorial. Lucas had stood right beside Victoria in the pouring rain as she wept physically, holding her up when her knees buckled by the fresh grave. But the message was there. The demanding tone, the arrogant punctuation, the intimate nickname. Vic. Lucas looked up. Victoria hadn't noticed him looking. She snatched the phone with a sudden, breathless panic, pressing the device to her chest as her face completely drained of color. Her breathing hitched, becoming shallow and erratic in the suffocating quiet of the room. "Everything okay?" Lucas asked. The calmness in his own voice terrified him. It was the icy, detached voice of a man stepping onto a battlefield, quietly assessing the enemy lines. "Just work," Victoria lied, her voice trembling slightly. She forced a hard swallow, slipping the phone deep into her cardigan pocket. "A crisis with the new ad campaign. I might need to step out later to make some calls from the office. It's too loud here." The house was dead silent, save for the ticking of the hallway clock. Lucas looked at his wife, the elegant curve of her neck, the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume, the stark animal terror hiding just behind her eyes. He didn't yell. He didn't demand to see the phone. A cold, absolute clarity washed over him, chilling him to the bone. He was standing in a house built on a grave, and the ghost was finally demanding its due. "Of course," Lucas said smoothly, setting the bread down with measured, deliberate precision. "You should do what you have to do." The rhythmic, bone-rattling thud of the hydraulic presses at Carter Industries was usually a comforting baseline to Lucas's day. For 12 years, the predictable mechanics of the manufacturing floor had grounded him. But this Wednesday morning, the noise felt violent, a blunt instrument battering against the sleep-deprived walls of his skull. He had stayed awake the previous night, listening from the dark of their bedroom as Victoria slipped out the front door at 10:45, the heavy engine of her Volvo fading into the rain. She had returned 2 hours later, smelling of damp earth, stale tobacco, and a frantic, nervous energy that had poisoned the air in their home. Lucas stood by the break room window, staring down at the warehouse floor without really seeing it. The lukewarm black coffee in his styrofoam cup had long gone bitter. The heavy metal door hissed open, bringing a brief swell of factory noise before sealing it out again. Emily Burton walked in. She was a quality control supervisor, a lifelong resident of Oak Haven, and one of the few people Lucas considered a genuine friend outside the perimeter of his marriage. Emily knew the undercurrents of the town better than the mayor. She knew whose mortgages were underwater, whose kids were in rehab, and whose marriages were held together by duct tape and Sunday church appearances. "You look like you slept on a bed of nails, Scott," Emily said, making a beeline for the vending machine. She punched in the code for a diet soda, the casual routine of her movements a stark contrast to the coiled spring tightening in Lucas's chest. "Just a long night," Lucas replied, his voice deliberately flat. He turned away from the window, leaning against the pale linoleum counter. "Anniversary dinner." "Right, 15 years. Emily offered a warm, if slightly distracted smile as she retrieved her can. "Congratulations. Did you guys end up doing the steakhouse in town, or—" Her voice trailed off as she finally looked up and met his eyes. Whatever she saw in his expression made her smile falter. The easy camaraderie evaporated from the sterile fluorescent-lit room, replaced by a sudden heavy atmospheric pressure. Lucas didn't blink. He kept his posture relaxed, his hands wrapped loosely around the styrofoam cup, but his gaze was sharp, pinning her down. Victoria had to step out. "A work emergency," she said. "Around 11. Emily's fingers tightened around her soda can. The aluminum gave a sharp, tiny crack. "Oh, that's a shame." "Yeah," Lucas said softly. He took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. He needed to know. He needed to know if he was losing his mind or if the ground beneath him had completely given way. "She got a text, Emily. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the phone lit up right in front of me. The initials were JG. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Emily didn't gasp. She didn't drop her drink. Instead, she went entirely rigidly still. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her face an ashen, sickly pale. She looked away, her eyes darting to the humming refrigerator, the bulletin board, the floor, anywhere but Lucas. She swallowed hard, a visible, anxious gulp that betrayed a terrifying amount of guilt. I don't know who that could be," Emily stammered, her voice dropping an octave, lacking any of its usual confident cadence. "Probably just a vendor. You know how her marketing firm is." She was lying. The physical evidence of her lie was so loud it was deafening. Lucas watched her, the cold dread solidifying into an immovable block of ice in his stomach. The town of Oak Haven was small. People talked. If Joseph Garcia was back, if he had never truly been in that casket, someone would have seen him. The whispers would have started at the grocery store, in the church pews, in the locker rooms. "Look at me, Emily," Lucas said, his tone devoid of anger, which only made it sound more terrifying. She couldn't. She grabbed a plastic stirrer she didn't need and focused intensely on the coffee pot. "I have to get back to the floor, Lucas. Line 3 is acting up." She hurried out of the break room, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving Lucas alone in the hum of the fluorescent lights. The betrayal wasn't just Victoria's anymore. It belonged to the town. He wasn't just a husband who was being lied to. He was a fool standing on a stage, unaware that the entire audience already knew the tragic ending of the play. The fog rolling off Lake Oak Haven had a way of swallowing sound, muting the quiet suburban streets into a ghostly silent film. Lucas had parked his Ford 3 blocks away from Crescent Park, killing the headlights a mile back to ensure the Volvo wouldn't catch his reflection in the rearview mirror. He walked the rest of the way on foot, the damp chill of the November air seeping through his wool coat, though he barely felt the cold. Crescent Park was a sprawling, neglected patch of green on the edge of the town's industrial sector, dominated by century-old oak trees with thick, twisting branches. It was a place for teenagers to drink cheap beer and for secrets to be buried. Tonight it was a site of resurrection. Lucas stepped off the gravel path, his boots sinking soundlessly into the wet earth. He positioned himself behind the massive, rough trunk of the oldest oak, blending entirely into the deep shadows. About 50 yards away, a single flickering halogen streetlight cast a sickly yellow pool on the pavement. Victoria stood in the center of that light. She wore her beige trench coat, the collar turned up against the wind, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso. She was pacing a tight, frantic movement that betrayed an anxiety Lucas had rarely seen in their 15 years together. She kept checking her phone, the screen briefly illuminating the stark terror on her face. Then a darker shadow detached itself from the tree line. Lucas stopped breathing. The metallic tang of adrenaline flooded his mouth. The figure stepped into the edge of the yellow light. The strike of a match flared suddenly, a brief violent burst of orange that illuminated the hollowed cheeks, the sharp jawline, and the dark, restless eyes. He looked rougher, older, the lines of his face carved deeper by 5 years of whatever hell he had been hiding in. But there was no mistaking the arrogant tilt of his head. Joseph Garcia, the man Lucas had helped bury, the man whose closed casket had sat at the front of St. Jude's while the town wept. Lucas's hands resting against the coarse bark of the oak tree curled into tight fists, his nails biting into his palms. He waited for Victoria to scream, to run, to react with the shock of a woman seeing a ghost. She did none of those things. Instead, a strangled sob echoed across the empty park. Victoria practically lunged forward, closing the distance between them. She didn't hit him. She didn't demand answers. She collapsed against his chest, her hands desperately gripping the lapels of his worn leather jacket. Joseph caught her, easily wrapping his arms around her with a familiar, possessive ease, burying his face in her hair. It was an embrace built on a profound shared history. It was the desperate clinging of two people bound by something far heavier than romance. They were bound by a massive, unspeakable lie. Watching them, Lucas felt a strange, terrifying detachment wash over him. The blinding rage he expected never came. In its place, a glacial, absolute zero settled deep into his bones. He watched his wife weep into the neck of a dead man, her hands the same hands that had packed their daughter's lunch that morning, clinging to the very architect of their ruin. He didn't storm forward. He didn't pull her away. He simply stood in the dark, watching the life he had built burn to ash in the pale glow of a street lamp. The Lucas Scott who had worried about anniversary dinners and factory schedules died right there behind the oak tree. The man who turned around and walked silently back to his truck in the fog was someone entirely different. Someone with a very clear, very cold purpose. The house was completely still, settling into the deep, suffocating quiet of 3 a.m. Upstairs, Victoria was wrapped in their heavy down comforter, breathing the slow, rhythmic breaths of the deeply exhausted. She had returned from Crescent Park at 1 a.m, slipping into bed without showering, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of damp asphalt and stale tobacco under her vanilla perfume. Lucas had not said a word. He had lain beside her in the dark, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting until her breathing evened out. Then he rose, leaving the warmth of the bed to step into the freezing reality of their home. He was a man who understood logistics, supply chains, and inventory at Carter Industries. He knew that nothing in this modern world simply vanished without leaving a trace. Not heavy machinery, not money, and certainly not a desperate man like Joseph Garcia. Sitting in the cramped spare room they called an office, Lucas bathed in the harsh blue glow of his dual monitors. Victoria was meticulous about the branding campaigns for her marketing firm, but she had always been dangerously complacent with her personal digital footprint, relying entirely on the illusion of their domestic trust. Lucas bypassed her simple laptop password, their daughter's birth year, and began his quiet excavation. He wasn't looking for love letters. He wasn't looking for poetry or apologies. He was looking for numbers. For 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic clicking of the mouse and the low, rattling hum of the HV8 unit kicking on against the November chill. He dug through archived folders buried deep within tax documents from 5 years ago. He finally located a hidden password-protected directory labeled simply Estate Adjustments 2018, the year Joseph supposedly burned in that wreck on Route 90. Using a brute force script he'd learned from the floor technicians at work, Lucas broke the encryption in minutes. What he found was not a confession of forbidden romance. It was a ledger of survival written in cold hard currency. The scanned documents and offshore receipts painted a terrifyingly clear picture. Joseph had not died in a tragic accident. He had been drowning in six-figure gambling debts owed to a violent syndicate operating out of Atlantic City. There were photos of property damage, threatening emails printed and saved as PDFs, and finally a meticulously drafted financial escape route. And Victoria had funded it. Lucas stared at the screen, his eyes burning dry, tracing the flow of capital. Withdrawals from her private accounts. A liquidated mutual fund she had sworn went toward her late mother's medical care. Wire transfers to a shell company in the Cayman Islands executed just 3 days before the fiery crash. She had bought the illusion of a dead body. She had paid for the ashes the entire town of Oakhaven had mourned. He leaned back in his ergonomic chair, the leather creaking softly in the oppressive silence. The realization did not make him want to scream or throw the monitor against the wall. It made him feel profoundly, dangerously hollow. His marriage was not just a failure, it was an active accessory to a massive fraud. Every anniversary dinner, every family vacation, every quiet Sunday morning, reading the newspaper on the porch, it was all constructed on a foundation of rotting, expensive lies. He had spent the last 5 years comforting a grieving widow who just happened to be playing the role of his wife. He methodically closed the files, clearing the cache, and leaving absolutely no trace of his digital intrusion. The Lucas Scott who believed in vows and forgiveness in the sanctity of their suburban life evaporated into the shadows of the room. What remained was a man evaluating a broken machine, calculating exactly how to dismantle it piece by piece so it could never be put back together again. Dawn broke over Oakhaven not with sunlight, but with a slow creeping gray that leached the color from the suburban streets. Inside the home office, Lucas had not moved from his chair. The dual monitors cast a harsh, unforgiving light on his exhausted face. He had spent the last 3 hours crossing the bridge from the lies of the past to the theft of the present. Having uncovered the architecture of Joseph's fake death, Lucas turned his attention to their current reality. He logged into their joint banking portal, a shared digital space he usually only visited to pay the mortgage and verify their daughter's college fund contributions. The main checking account looked normal. The savings account was untouched. It was a perfect, reassuring facade, much like Victoria herself. But Lucas was no longer looking at the surface. He dug into the credit inquiries, the secondary routing numbers, and the recent mail alerts he had absent-mindedly dismissed as junk. It took him 20 minutes to find the shadow account. Victoria had opened a new high-yield line of credit under her own name, leveraging the equity of the very house Lucas was sitting in. The balance was staggering, $50,000. It had been approved and transferred just 3 days ago, exactly when Victoria's anxiety over her marketing campaigns had supposedly peaked. The pieces snapped together with the sickening precision of a loaded gun. Joseph Garcia hadn't returned from the grave out of lingering romance. He had returned because whatever hole he had been hiding in had dried up. He was a ghost demanding a new toll, and Victoria was willingly gutting her family's financial security to pay it. Lucas stared at the blinking cursor, his pulse beating a slow, heavy rhythm in his throat. $50,000. It was the exact amount they had discussed setting aside for their daughter's out-of-state tuition next year. Victoria was handing their child's future to a degenerate gambler who was supposed to be a pile of ashes. Down the hall, the floorboards creaked. The sound was soft, the familiar shuffle of Victoria waking up to use the bathroom. Lucas sat perfectly still in the dim office, the door cracked open just an inch. He could hear the rush of water from the faucet, the soft click of the medicine cabinet. A lesser man would have marched down that hallway. He would have thrown the door open, flipped on the harsh vanity lights, and shoved the printed bank statements into her face. He would have screamed until his vocal cords tore, demanding to know how she could look their daughter in the eye. But the anger Lucas felt had bypassed heat entirely. It was absolute zero. Confrontation meant a messy, drawn-out divorce. It meant lawyers, mediators, and Victoria playing the weeping victim to the town of Oakhaven, spinning a narrative of a misunderstood woman trapped in an unhappy marriage. Lucas slowly closed the banking portal window. He didn't want a divorce settlement. He wanted a reckoning. He opened a new browser tab, navigating to his own private accounts, the ones established long before the marriage. With methodical, unhurried keystrokes, he began the quiet, complex process of untangling his financial life from hers. He was going to build a firewall around what was his, and he was going to leave Victoria holding the lit match she had so carelessly struck. The pipes groaned as the bathroom faucet was shut off. Soft footsteps retreated back into the master bedroom. Lucas sat alone in the glow of the monitors, a ghost in his own home, carefully drafting the blueprints for its demolition. The following Monday passed with a terrifying normalcy. Lucas went to work at Carter Industries, drank his bitter coffee in the break room, and signed off on the weekly floor manifests. He smiled at Emily Burton in the hallway, offering a brief, reassuring nod that made her shoulders drop in visible relief. She thought the storm had passed. Everyone in Oakhaven thought the surface of the water was calm. They didn't know the undertow was already dragging the foundation away. At 2 a.m. on Tuesday, while a heavy frost settled over the quiet suburban lawns, Lucas sat in the pale glow of his laptop for the final time. The legal maneuvers had taken 3 agonizing days of careful phone calls during his lunch breaks and encrypted digital signatures. Now it was time to pull the trigger. With steady, unhesitating fingers, he initiated the transfers. The joint savings account, built over 15 years of overtime and skipped vacations, was cleanly bifurcated. His legal half was routed to an untraceable account under a new LLC he had formed over the weekend. More importantly, he transferred the entirety of their daughter's college fund into an irrevocable trust, one that Victoria, with her sudden appetite for high-yield debt and phantom lovers, could never touch. He left the new line of credit exactly as it was, $50,000 in the red, bearing Victoria's digital signature tied exclusively to her hidden maneuverings. He was leaving her the house, the Volvo, and the crushing weight of the financial crater she had dug for Joseph Garcia. Lucas closed the laptop. The quiet click of the screen shutting felt louder than a gunshot in the silent house. He stood up, his joints stiff, and walked silently down the carpeted hallway to the master bedroom. The room smelled of lavender, linen spray, and the faint, lingering exhaust of Victoria's late-night drives. She was asleep on her side, one arm draped casually over the empty space where Lucas usually lay. Her face was relaxed, the harsh lines of her secret anxiety smoothed out by deep slumber. Lucas didn't feel a surge of hatred as he looked at her. He didn't feel love either. He felt the terrifying, hollow neutrality of a stranger. He moved to his side of the walk-in closet, guided only by the ambient moonlight filtering through the blinds. He pulled a heavy canvas duffel bag from the top shelf. He didn't pack photographs. He didn't take the silver watch she had given him for his 30th birthday, nor the custom-tailored suits he wore to Oakhaven's annual charity galas. He packed 4 pairs of jeans, a handful of plain shirts, heavy socks, and his oldest steel-toed work boots. He packed the bare necessities of a man who intended to vanish into the gray canvas of a different state, a different life. The metallic slide of the zipper closing the duffel bag was sharp and definitive. He slung the heavy strap over his shoulder, the canvas rough against his collarbone. He took one last look around the bedroom. The framed wedding photo on the dresser, the plush rug underfoot, the woman breathing softly in the dark. It was a museum exhibit of a life he no longer inhabited. Lucas turned his back on the room and walked silently down the stairs, his footsteps making no sound on the hardwood, leaving nothing behind but the suffocating weight of an impending dawn. Tuesday morning arrived with a biting, clear frost that coated the windows of the Oakhaven suburbs in a thin layer of ice. Victoria woke at 6:30, her internal clock pulling her from a deep, dreamless sleep. She reached across the mattress. The sheets on Lucas's side were cold, the duvet perfectly flat. It wasn't entirely unusual for him to take the early shift at Carter Industries, but the house felt uncharacteristically hollow. There was no familiar, comforting grind of coffee beans from the kitchen, no muffled voice of the morning news anchor drifting up the stairs. She pulled her silk robe tightly around her waist, shivering slightly as she stepped into the hallway. The house was entirely silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. She walked down the wooden stairs, her bare feet making no sound. The kitchen was immaculate. The ambient gray light of the dawn cast long, harsh shadows across the granite island. Right in the center, isolated in the vast expanse of the countertop, lay a single sheet of printer paper. Sitting perfectly still in the middle of the pile, acting as a paperweight, was Lucas's gold wedding band. The sight of the dull, scratched metal made Victoria's breath catch sharply in her throat. Her heart executed a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She approached the island with hesitant, agonizingly slow steps, her mind struggling to process the visual anomaly. She looked down at the paper. It wasn't a handwritten letter. It was a printed bank document. It was the statement for the high-yield line of credit she had secretly opened just days prior. The balance glared up at her in stark, unforgiving black ink, minus $50,000. Beneath the printed table of routing numbers and equity leverages, Lucas had written exactly 2 sentences in his precise architectural handwriting. "I hope the resurrection was worth the price. The debt and the ghost are entirely yours now." Victoria stopped breathing. She stared at the words, her eyes tracing the letters over and over, trying to find a different meaning, a misunderstanding, an out. Resurrection. Ghost. He knew. He didn't just know about the late-night meeting at Crescent Park. He knew about the money. He knew about the offshore accounts. He knew that the man Oakhaven had mourned 5 years ago was currently breathing, hiding, and waiting for his payout. Lucas had known, and he had sat across from her at the dinner table, poured her wine, and watched her sleep. A high-pitched metallic ringing began in Victoria's ears, drowning out the ticking of the hallway clock. She looked up, her panicked eyes darting wildly around the pristine kitchen, the empty living room, the neatly arranged shoes by the front door. Lucas's heavy winter boots were missing. He wasn't at the factory. He wasn't coming back. He had systematically mapped out her entire web of deception in absolute silence, severed his ties, and vanished into the night. He had left her utterly alone with a dead man and a mountain of debt. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to sustain life. The edges of her vision began to darken, a thick, suffocating blackness and creeping in from the corners of the room. A profound physiological terror seized her. She reached out her manicured fingers, scrambling for purchase against the edge of the cold granite, but her grip failed. The meticulously constructed world of Victoria Sterling shattered completely. Her knees buckled under the unbearable weight of her own ruin. Gravity pulled her down with a brutal, unapologetic force, and she collapsed hard against the freezing ceramic tile. The last image that registered in her fading consciousness was the gold wedding band gleaming coldly beside the exact price tag of her sins before the darkness swallowed her whole. It took exactly 4 days for the town of Oakhaven to devour Victoria Sterling. Small insular communities operated on a currency of whispered tragedies, and the sudden inexplicable vanishing of Lucas Scott was an absolute goldmine. The fluorescent lights of Miller's Market buzzed with a sickly yellow hum. Victoria stood in aisle 4 staring blindly at a row of imported pastas she had no intention of buying. She wore oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses and a heavy wool coat, a pathetic, obvious shield against the suffocating atmosphere of the grocery store. At the end of the aisle, 2 women from the local zoning board stopped their carts. They didn't approach her. Instead, their voices dropped to that specific carrying pitch reserved for suburban scandals. Snippets of their conversation drifted over the ambient noise of the refrigeration units. Accounts completely drained. I heard the bank is already looking at the house. Just packed a bag and left her. Victoria's knuckles turned white as she gripped the handle of her plastic shopping basket. The stares felt physical, like coarse sandpaper dragging across her skin. She abandoned the basket right there on the linoleum floor and walked briskly toward the automatic sliding doors, desperate for the freezing November air. As she reached her car in the gray, slush-filled parking lot, her phone vibrated. It was a text from a burner number. 20 minutes later, Victoria parked behind the rusted chain-link fence of the abandoned lumberyard on the edge of the county line. Joseph was waiting. He leaned against the hood of a beat-up sedan, smoking a cigarette. When she approached, he didn't pull her into the desperate, sweeping embrace he had used at Crescent Park. The predatory warmth was entirely gone, replaced by a tense, twitchy irritation. "Did you get the wire transfer?" he asked, skipping any semblance of a greeting. His breath plumed white in the bitter chill. Victoria wrapped her arms around her torso, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. "I can't. Lucas." He knew Joe. He figured it out. Joseph froze the cigarette, halting halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean he knew?" "He took his half of everything. He locked our daughter's college fund in an impenetrable trust. He left in the middle of the night." Her voice cracked, the sheer exhaustion breaking through her composed veneer. "I don't have $50,000. I have $50,000 in debt. He left the line of credit entirely in my name. The bank froze my primary cards this morning." Joseph stared at her. The dark, romantic eyes that had haunted her dreams for 5 years narrowed into thin, calculating slits. The charming, tortured ghost vanished in the freezing wind, leaving only the desperate, hollow hustler she had mortgaged her soul to protect. "You're broke," he stated flatly. It wasn't a question. It was an assessment of a defunct asset. "I have nothing." Victoria choked out, hot tears finally spilling over her numb cheeks, ruining her careful makeup. "He knows you're alive. If he knows, the whole town will know soon. Take me with you, Joe, please. I gave up everything for you. I did it twice. It was a pathetic, desperate plea. It was the absolute death of her dignity. Joseph dropped his cigarette into the slush and crushed it beneath his boot. He didn't look at her with pity, and certainly not with love. He looked at her the way a gambler looks at a losing hand. If he knows I can't stay here, the Atlantic City guys have ears everywhere, Joseph said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. He opened the door of his sedan. He didn't even pause to look back at her trembling figure. You didn't give up anything for me, Vic. You bought an illusion, and your car just declined. The engine turned over with a harsh, grinding rattle. Victoria stood frozen in the dirt, watching the red taillights fade into the bleak gray horizon of the highway. The silence that settled over the abandoned lot was absolute and deafening. She was entirely alone, a pariah, in a town that despised her, tethered to a crushing, inescapable debt for a dead man who had just buried her alive. The front door of the Oak Haven house opened and closed with a heavy, definitive thud that echoed through the unnervingly quiet foyer. Victoria, sitting in the darkened living room with a lukewarm cup of tea she hadn't tasted, flinched. She listened to the familiar squeak of her 16-year-old daughter's sneakers on the hardwood floor. Maya did not call out. She didn't drop her backpack by the console table as she usually did. She walked straight past the arched doorway of the living room, her face pale and set in lines that made her look terrifyingly like Lucas. Maya. Victoria's voice was a fragile, papery thing. She pushed herself up from the armchair, wrapping her oversized cardigan tighter around her shivering frame. There was no answer, only the steady, rhythmic sound of footsteps ascending the stairs. Victoria followed a sickening knot of dread pulling tight in her stomach. By the time she reached the threshold of her daughter's bedroom, Maya had already pulled a purple canvas suitcase from beneath her bed. It was flipped open on the mattress, and she was methodically tossing in folded jeans, sweaters, and her laptop charger. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" Victoria asked, stepping into the room. She reached out a trembling hand toward the door frame, needing the physical support to stay upright. Maya stopped folding. She didn't turn around immediately. When she finally looked over her shoulder, the expression in her eyes caused the breath to physically leave Victoria's lungs. There was no anger. There were no tears. There was only a cold, glacial disgust, a profound detachment, as if she were looking at a stranger who had tracked mud onto the living room rug. "Don't call me that," Maya said. Her voice was steady, lacking any of the usual teenage volatility. "Emily is on her way to pick me up. I'm staying in her guest room." "Emily," Victoria choked on the name. "Maya, you can't just leave. We need to talk. I know things are confusing right now with your father gone, but..." "Confusing?" Maya let out a short, hollow laugh that held zero humor. She turned, fully dropping a handful of socks into the suitcase. "It's not confusing, Mom. It's actually really clear. Everyone at school is talking about it. The parents, the teachers. They're all whispering about the ghost of Joseph Garcia." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. The floorboards seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "Maya, please. You don't understand. I understand that Dad worked 60-hour weeks at Carter Industries while you were draining my college fund to pay off a dead man's gambling debts." Maya interrupted, her tone brutally precise. Every word was a meticulously placed scalpel cutting away the last shreds of Victoria's maternal authority. "I understand that you cried at a funeral for a man you were still sleeping with. I was trying to protect us," Victoria sobbed, the tears finally spilling over, a desperate, pathetic attempt to rewrite the narrative. "He threatened us, Maya. You don't know what he was capable of." "Stop lying," Maya said quietly. The absolute flatness of the command was worse than if she had screamed. She zipped the suitcase shut with a sharp final scrape of metal. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting a lie. And Dad finally figured it out." Maya grabbed the handle of the suitcase and walked toward the door. Victoria instinctively moved to block her path, but Maya didn't even pause. She simply stared at her mother, the look of profound revulsion freezing Victoria in her tracks. Victoria stepped aside, shrinking against the doorframe. A car horn beeped lightly from the driveway. Emily Burton's sensible sedan. "Don't call my phone," Maya said, not looking back as she walked down the hallway. "And don't come to Emily's house. You have nothing left to say that I want to hear." Victoria stood in the doorway of the empty bedroom, listening to the heavy thud of the front door closing for the second time that afternoon. The silence that rushed in to fill the house was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a suffocating, crushing entity that settled over her shoulders, confirming that the devastation was finally and irreversibly complete. The rain in Astoria, Oregon was fundamentally different from the heavy rhythmic downpours of Oak Haven. It didn't drum against the glass. It misted a constant, pervasive gray fog that seemed to bypass clothing and settle directly into the bones. It had been 7 months since Lucas had walked out of his own life. He now answered to the name David, working the quiet, solitary morning shifts at a local maritime supply warehouse near the docks. The physical labor of moving heavy canvas in nautical chains was mindless, and the people were naturally averse to asking questions about a man in his 40s who drank his coffee black and never spoke of a past. Lucas sat at the small, wobbly laminate table in his rented, sparsely furnished studio apartment. The view out his single window was a bleak expanse of churning gray water and rusted fishing trawlers. He took a sip of his coffee. It tasted burnt. Everything seemed to taste slightly burnt these days, an ever-present layer of ash coating his tongue. He had achieved exactly what he had set out to do with cold, architectural precision. According to the sparse updates from his lawyer, Victoria was a ruined woman, a cautionary tale buried under a mountain of unpayable debt in absolute social exile in a town that thrived on judgment. More importantly, he had secured Maya's future. The trust fund was locked so tight that not even a team of desperate creditors could pry it open to cover Victoria's catastrophic mistakes. It was a flawless surgical extraction. So why did the victory feel like a crushing, physical weight resting on his chest? Lucas stared at the cheap, prepaid cell phone lying flat on the table next to his mug. It was the only tether he had kept to the old world, a sterile number known exclusively to Emily Burton and the trust attorney. He had not heard his daughter's voice in 212 days. When he packed that canvas duffel bag in the dead of night, he had convinced himself that a clean break was the only way. He believed that remaining in Oak Haven would only force Maya to choose sides in a grotesque, highly publicized divorce, dragging her through the mud of her mother's sordid affairs. He had thought that removing himself from the blast radius, silently bearing the label of the vanishing father, was an act of profound mercy. But in the quiet, damp solitude of the Oregon coast, the truth began to rot the edges of his righteous anger. He hadn't just punished Victoria. He had effectively orphaned his own child. Maya was living in a guest room, navigating the brutal, unforgiving social hierarchy of high school with the twin stigmas of a scandalous mother and a father who had evaporated into thin air. He had protected her money, but he had abandoned her heart. Lucas stood up and walked to the window, resting his forehead against the freezing glass. He watched a lone seabird struggle against the wind over the dark swells. For 5 years, he had harbored a silent, retrospective hatred for Joseph Garcia, for being a ghost, for haunting a marriage from the shadows, and letting others bear the weight of his absence. Yet here he was, 3 states away, living under an assumed identity, haunting the periphery of his own existence. He had burned the house down to eradicate the disease, but he was the one left shivering in the cold, staring at the embers. The vengeance he had so carefully curated offered absolutely no warmth. Suddenly, the prepaid phone on the laminate table vibrated. The harsh mechanical buzz shattered the quiet of the apartment. Lucas turned his breath, catching sharply in his throat. No one called this number casually. It was a line designated only for absolute necessities. He stared at the glowing rectangle from across the room, a sudden cold dread washing over him, terrified that the echoes of Oak Haven had finally crossed the distance to demand a new toll. The prepaid phone vibrated a second time, the harsh plastic casing rattling against the cheap laminate of the table. Lucas stood across the room, the damp chill of the Oregon coast seeping through his boots, his eyes locked on the glowing screen. For 7 months, that phone had been a silent tombstone. Now it was demanding his attention. He crossed the narrow room with heavy, reluctant steps. He picked up the device. It was an encrypted email notification from the secure address he had left solely with Emily Burton. The subject line was a single word, Maya. Lucas felt the air leave his lungs. He sank into the hard wooden chair, his thumb hesitating over the screen before he finally opened the message. Emily's writing was entirely devoid of pleasantries. It was the desperate, blunt dispatch of a medic in a war zone he had deserted. Lucas, I promised I wouldn't reach out unless the foundation caved in. It has. The bank finalized the foreclosure on the house 3 weeks ago. Victoria is living out of the Starlight Motel on the edge of town. She doesn't go to work. She barely speaks. The town finally stopped gossiping about her affair and started pitying her, which is somehow worse. Lucas skimmed over the details of Victoria's ruin. This was the exact outcome he had engineered. But the next paragraph struck him with the force of a physical blow. But I'm not writing this for her. I'm writing this because Maya is drowning. She got suspended from school yesterday. She started a screaming match with a teacher, threw a desk, and walked out. She doesn't sleep. She sits in my guest room, staring at the wall. You thought securing her college fund was enough, Lucas, but she doesn't care about the money. She thinks your disappearance means she wasn't worth staying for. She feels the betrayal of her mother, but she is being buried by the abandonment of her father. You wanted to punish your wife, but you are actively destroying your daughter. The glowing text blurred in front of Lucas's eyes. A profound, suffocating silence pressed in on the small apartment, heavier than the rain outside. He slowly lowered the phone, the screen casting a pale blue light across his knuckles. The absolute certainty of his righteousness, the cold armor he had worn since the night he saw Joseph Garcia under the oak tree, cracked and fell away. Emily's words echoed in the hollow spaces of his chest, exposing the ugly truth he had refused to examine. He had convinced himself that leaving was stoicism. He had framed his silent exit as a noble sacrifice to avoid a messy divorce that would taint Maya's high school years. But looking at the bleak gray walls of his rented room, the deception unraveled. He hadn't left to protect Maya. He had left because he couldn't bear the humiliation of staying. In his pursuit of a flawless, surgical vengeance, he had become the very thing he despised. He had become a ghost. Just like Joseph Garcia, he had abandoned the women in his life to clean up the wreckage he left behind, hiding in the shadows while they paid the emotional toll of his absence. Lucas looked toward the corner of the room where his heavy canvas duffel bag sat gathering dust. The revenge had tasted like ash, but the guilt was a living, breathing fire. He reached for his laptop, his fingers rigid but steady as he opened a new tab to search for the next outbound flight to Oak Haven. The time for hiding in the fog was over. He had a debt of his own to pay. The November air in Oak Haven felt exactly as it had 7 months ago, sharp, metallic, and unforgiving. Lucas Scott sat on a weathered wooden bench in Crescent Park, the collar of his wool coat turned up against the biting wind. The sun was bleeding out over the horizon, casting long, bruised streaks of violet and burnt to orange across the sky. 50 yards away stood the massive, twisting trunk of the old oak tree, its bare branches clawing at the fading light. It was the exact spot where his old life had ended. He had been in town for barely 48 hours. The legal proceedings at the attorney's office that morning had been brief, sterilized of all human emotion. He had signed the final divorce decrees in a quiet, mahogany-paneled conference room. Victoria had not been present. Her court-appointed representative had handled the paperwork. There was no screaming, no tearful apology, no dramatic climax, just the dry scratch of a fountain pen severing 15 years of history, leaving her to the ruins of her motel room and her insurmountable debts. The real reckoning had happened yesterday, sitting on the edge of a twin bed in Emily Burton's guest room. Maya had not hugged him when he walked in. She had stared at him with eyes that looked entirely too old, holding a defensive posture that shattered his heart all over again. They had talked for hours in hesitant, fractured sentences. Lucas didn't offer excuses for his disappearance, and he didn't demand instant forgiveness. He simply offered his presence, a promise to stay, and a quiet admission of his own profound failure. It was a fragile bleeding wound, but for the first time in months, it was a wound they were tending to together. He was taking her back to Oregon with him at the end of the week. Now alone in the dying light of the park, Lucas watched the shadows stretch across the frost-covered grass. He felt the phantom weight of the canvas duffel bag he had carried away, and the staggering reality of the wreckage he had returned to. He had learned a brutal lesson in the mathematics of betrayal. Victoria had bankrupted their family to pay a ghost, and in response, Lucas had bankrupted his own soul to ensure her destruction. He had successfully orchestrated the perfect payback, only to discover that vengeance was a currency that bought absolutely nothing of value. It couldn't buy back the years. It couldn't restore his daughter's innocence. It certainly couldn't resurrect the man he used to be before he stood behind that oak tree. A solitary streetlight flickered to life, buzzing softly in the stillness of the park. It cast a pale yellow pool on the empty pavement where Joseph Garcia had once stood. There were no ghosts here tonight. There was only the quiet, breathing reality of a town moving on, indifferent to the tragedies of the people who lived within it. Lucas stood up from the bench, his joints stiff from the cold. He didn't look back at the oak tree, nor did he look toward the direction of the Starlight Motel, where his ex-wife was currently serving the life sentence of her own choices. The anger had finally burned itself out, leaving only a vast, quiet acceptance of the scars they would all carry. He shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets and began the long walk back to Emily's house. The air was freezing, but for the first time since that rainy anniversary dinner, his lungs expanded fully, taking in the sharp, clean bite of the evening. The ledgers of the past were closed, and tomorrow, in the harsh light of morning, the heavy, slow work of living would finally begin again.